My name is Steve Liefman. I was a judge on the Miami-Dade County Court for 30 years. My journey into mental health actually began one morning when I was getting ready to go on the bench. I had a case where the defendant turned out to be a Harvard-educated psychiatrist who had a late onset of schizophrenia, became homeless, and started cycling in and out of the criminal justice and homelessness. His case was really a window to everything that was wrong with both our response in our community mental health system and the response by the court on how to handle these cases. In fact, candidly, we were making matters worse. We were endangering public safety. We were wasting critical tax dollars, and we were watching the same people cycle in and out of the system again and again. We recognized early on that law enforcement officers were dealing with severe PTSD. People need to realize that last year and the year before, more police officers die from suicide than in the line of duty. And not only do they have high suicide rates, they have high divorce rates, substance use rates, and domestic violence rates. And most of it you can trace back to PTSD. And PTSD is not an emotional response. It is a physiological change in the brain as a result of being exposed to really horrific trauma. And it turns out that most of the people in jail and prison in the United States also have severe PTSD. In fact, 92% of all the women in jail and prison in the United States with serious mental illnesses were victims of severe trauma as children, mostly sexual abuse, when they were 5, 6, 7 years old. 75% of men who are in jail and prison with serious mental illnesses have severe histories of trauma. Some of it's sexual abuse, but more common, they were victims of long-term domestic violence, or they were witnesses to really violent acts like a soldier might see in combat. And I have to tell you that a young brain that is not fully developed, that's exposed to trauma, is damaged even more than an adult brain.
Today's show is brought to you via collaboration with the Miami's community newspapers. My name is Robert Asensio. This is another episode of Bets and Badges. I am joined by Judge Steve Liefman. Judge Liefman is a pioneer in the mental health court system. He will provide for us a briefing on the evolution of how the justice system deals with mental health patients.
When I was an intern for then State Senator Bob Graham, he had received a letter from the then editor of the Miami Herald, Jim Hampton, about a young man who was stuck at the local state psychiatric hospital in Pembroke Pines. And I guess being the lowest person on the totem pole as an intern, I was assigned to go to the hospital to check out the situation. And this is many, many years ago. It was really a scene out of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And what I saw that day, no one should probably ever see in a lifetime. It was pretty horrific. And the young man that I went to go visit, he was in all 4-point restraints. He was being injected with Thorazine, which was the only medication back in those days. This is probably 40-something years ago. And he was about 150 pounds overweight. He was screaming and moaning and crying. And I later learned while I was there that not only was he not psychotic, but it turned out that he was autistic and never should have been medicated at all. And it was probably why the state hospitals got closed, because of all the damage and inhumane treatment that people were going through. But while I was there, a group of advocates just happened to be there that day, and they heard there was a representative from a legislator's office, albeit a 17-year-old intern who had no power and knew nothing. But they insisted I go on a tour of the facility. They took me downstairs, which I still remember like yesterday, was like a dungeon where there were 7 men lying naked in their own feces while a guard stood there and washed them and hosed them down like they were animals in a zoo. That was the state of mental health back then. The tragedy is that we had this perfect storm. President Kennedy, and one of his last public bill signings, signed this amazing act, which was called the Community Mental Health Act. And the idea was to build a really robust community mental health system and take people out of these state hospitals that shouldn't be there. His sister Rose had severe mental health issues, and so he and the family were very sensitive to it. And at the same time, colliding with this was an amazing federal case that came out of the state of Alabama that extended protections that were not there before. We already knew that if you were in jail, you had a constitutional right to adequate health care, but no such protection existed if you were in a state civil hospital. And so this amazing judge, Judge Johnson out of Alabama, issues this incredible opinion. And it's really the seminal case in the United States that leads to the closure and deinstitutionalization of all of our state hospitals. And so you have this case leading to deinstitutionalization. President Kennedy signs this amazing act, but tragically, due to his assassination and the escalation of the Vietnam War, not one penny of the hundreds of millions of dollars that had been authorized were ever appropriated. And then we started to move towards the 70s, 80s, where we had massive cuts to housing, and it created this perfect storm where this population got thrown into communities that was never built for them. And so the great irony is that what I saw as a 17-year-old intern left those hospitals, but that same population then moved into a different institution, our jail institutions and prisons. And as bad as they were being treated in the 60s, they ended up being treated worse in the 80s. And so we never deinstitutionalized. What we did is we transferred responsibilities from these really horrible state hospitals to these really horrible jails and prisons. And in some ways it made it worse because now not only did you have a serious mental illness, but now you had a serious mental illness with a criminal record, making it harder to get housing, making it harder to get employment, making it much more difficult to ever get into recovery. Plus, the science has changed rapidly in a good way. We know so much more about the brain today than we did just 20 years ago. For instance, we know that for people that have long-term psychosis, for many of them who go untreated, the gray matter in the brain is getting destroyed and they're becoming permanently disabled. So after we had this horrible situation with the psychiatrist, I was pretty early in my career. Because I had been head of the county court for the public defender's office, when I got appointed, they didn't want me hearing cases from the lawyers that I had supervised. So of course, having no experience with any civil law at all, they sent me to civil court for 2 years. And after all those young lawyers graduated out of the county court, they brought me back to the criminal division. And that's when I ended up with this case. But what made that case so significant was this fascinating case that came out of the Florida Supreme Court. It was called State v. Onwu. Because what ends up happening is that guy, the psychiatrist, he was in on some BS charge. It was like possession of a dairy cart. It wasn't even a Florida statutory offense like you used to do. It was a local county ordinance, punishable by 60 days. And it's one of those laws that some people probably view as a pretext for law enforcement to pick homeless people up. But what I found, that's such a ridiculously simple comment and not necessarily true. But the police, many of them, were under the same misconceptions that we had, that if you got arrested and you had a serious mental illness, you'd get treatment. And so most of the time, many of the officers were picking people up to try to get them treated because the civil system, the Baker Act system, is terrible and doesn't really work either. And so they were frustrated. They would arrest thinking the person got treated. And I thought the same thing when I became a judge. There was no training for judges at that point on mental health when I got appointed.
Bets and Badges, you can catch us on all major podcast platforms like Spotify, iHeart, Amazon, Apple, YouTube, or on the web at www.betsandbadges.com or at the miamiscommunitynewspapers.com website.
So there was no treatment for people when they got arrested. I believed otherwise. There was no training for judges back then when we were appointed. I had no idea what to do with people with mental illnesses, how to talk to people with mental illnesses, or what to do with their cases when they were floridly psychotic and probably incompetent to stand trial. So all I was taught to do is that if someone acted strange or bizarre, I was to order a psychological evaluation. So I'm having this amazing conversation with this guy. He's super smart. He knows the system really well. He's probably more respectful than the lawyers. And he's insisting that there's absolutely nothing wrong with him, that he didn't have any kind of mental health disorder. And if you just listened to him, you thought you were listening to a Harvard-educated psychiatrist, which he was. But if you looked at him, he looked like a homeless guy that hadn't bathed in months. So he's like, Judge, look, I shouldn't be here. It's ridiculous. Nobody goes to jail on a charge like this. And in fact, why would you keep me in a jail when we have really dangerous people here in Miami that should be in this cell, not me? Because if you let me out, I promise you, I'll go see a psychiatrist. I'll get evaluated, and you'll see that nothing is wrong with you. And I'm like, it's ridiculous to keep this guy in jail on such a ridiculous charge for so long. So I said, can I ask you a question? He's like, sure, Your Honor. I said, I just don't understand one thing. You keep insisting that there's absolutely nothing wrong with you. But if that's the case, why would a Harvard-educated psychiatrist be in jail, be homeless, and cycling in and out of the criminal justice system? Well, I triggered a full-blown psychotic episode. He started hugging himself. He started shaking back and forth. He started cupping ears because he was hearing voices. And all of a sudden, he starts to scream at the top of his lungs. And he's pointing to the back of the courtroom. And everything he screams is in sixes. And he starts to yell, Your Honor, Your Honor, Your Honor. You have to have this cup removed. You have to have this cup removed. And I said to him, aren't those your parents? No. Real parents. Died. Holocaust. And they're from the CIA, and they came to kill me. And the only thing that you could hear in the courtroom was his poor mother crying. And the only stupid thing I had been taught to do at that early part of my career was to order a psychological evaluation to see if he was competent, because clearly he was acting strange and bizarre. I order the first evaluation, comes back a month later, order 2 more because I needed 3 at the time to get the lawyers to stipulate or agree that he was incompetent. I order 2 more. He's now in jail, I don't know, at least 12, 14 weeks on a charge he can only get 60 days on. All 3 evaluations come back and they say the exact same thing. Not only is he incompetent, but he is so sick that he is now eminently dangerous to himself or others, and he needs to be involuntarily committed. I'm like, oh, this is great, because I had spoken to the parents beforehand. I had promised them I would get him help. They had tried everything. I order all these I order the evaluations. I have the lawyer stipulate that he's incompetent, and I assume I get to now order him into some kind of treatment. I hand the evaluations to the lawyers, and I look down, and I notice the assistant public defender has a grin on her face. As a former assistant public defender, this is not a good sign. And then she utters those magic words that judges do not appreciate. She says to me, Your Honor, in all due respect, because when a lawyer says that to a judge, it has nothing to do with respect. It's basically how they call us idiots without going to jail. And she whips out this Florida Supreme Court opinion, which of course I had not seen because it had come out recently and I had been in civil the last 2 years. And I take one look at it, I read it, and I almost fall off my chair on the bench. I just couldn't believe it. It was so bad that I went and took a break and called our legal division to have them read it to make sure I was reading it the right way. And what did it say? It said county court judges, of which I was, have 0 legal authority to either civilly or forensically commit anybody that meets that criteria, and that my only option was to release him back to the street, a man who is floridly psychotic, eminently dangerous to self or others, and tell him to go see a psychiatrist, exactly what he had told me he was supposed to do some 12 weeks earlier. And none of us go into our professions to be part of that kind of problem. Not only did I not fulfill the promise I made his poor parents, I put him at risk, I put the community at risk. God forbid something terrible happened to him or he did something terrible to someone, I probably put my job at risk, but I followed the law. And in like the first paragraph, in big letters, the Supreme Court says, we do not like this opinion, and we strongly urge the Florida legislature to address this hole in the law. Could you imagine? It only took 25 years for them to finally address it this last session. And it was based on what we did in Miami. They scaled the Miami model. But as a result of his case, fortuitously, the first national meeting on this issue was here in Miami. And I went, and it was amazing. I met this guy, Dr. Hank Stedman. He was the guru in the country at the time on these issues. It was like a revival. There were people talking about real problems and real solutions and how to address these issues to stop this cycling. I invited them to come to lunch in my chambers, the people that were running the conference. I gave them a tour of our horrible 9th floor of the Dade County Jail. They were aghast. And as a result, they gave us their last grant of the year. And I think one of the best things about being a judge is that when you invite people to meetings, they come. And I use the power, the moral authority of my position. And I invited all the traditional and stakeholders, traditional and non-traditional stakeholders in mental health to a 2-day summit at Jackson Memorial Hospital. And these experts came from around the country that were part of our grant, and they facilitated this amazing 2-day meeting. In the first half day of the meeting, we literally mapped out the intersection between criminal justice and mental health. And what we found is that us, so-called healthy, sane people, had devised a system to perfectly fail, and it failed perfectly. And it's expensive as hell. We were endangering public safety. We were wasting critical taxpayer dollars, and we were doing absolutely nothing to reduce homelessness or to help this population get back into recovery. And we realized that the sick ones were the system. It wasn't these poor individuals. And we decided that we would take a 2-part approach. And the 2-part approach was that we needed a pre-arrest diversion system. We needed a post-arrest diversion system. It was not about developing a mental health court, because mental health courts, while they sound great, they have to be done with great fidelity or they're not very effective. Number one is they only take about 1/10 of 1% of the people that need the help, so they don't really make a dent. And they usually take the wrong 1/10 of 1% because a lot of people don't understand these issues. Prosecutors get very nervous, and so they want the lower risk people that aren't going to reoffend anyway, and those aren't the people that should be in the program. And so we changed that. We threw that out the door, the window, and we created an entire restructuring of how we were going to approach this. And we wrote it up, and we put it in a memorandum or a cooperative agreement. I had all the different parties that helped us with it come to my chambers: the state attorney, public defender, county commissioners, police chiefs, the director, all those, now a sheriff, come together, Department of Children and Families, and agree that we would handle this differently. And it was this very prescriptive agreement. And we picked an arbitrary date, and we started. And I have to tell you, Robert, it far exceeded any expectation we had. The program reduced the number of arrests in Dade County from 118,000 a year to 53,000. The jail audit went from 7,400 to 4,400. It allowed us to close one of the 3 main jails in Dade County, the Women's Annex, at an actual savings, not a cost shift, of an actual savings of $14 million a year. It's been closed now 14 years, and we just updated the data, and we calculated the cost savings by adjusting for inflation. It's like $239 million in actual savings to the county budget over the last 14 years because of this project. And then something else happened that we had not anticipated at all. Our police shootings almost stopped. And why did that happen? Because we recognized early on that law enforcement officers were dealing with severe PTSD. And while, yes, race may play a role in some police shootings, I believe PTSD plays an even greater role in some police shootings, and that we never talk about it because we're too busy yelling at each other over all kinds of issues. And so my CIT coordinator, Hopsy, who's amazing, she gets between 150 and 250 calls a month from police officers that we have trained for their own personal mental health issues. And so we went to the Police Chiefs Association and we said, look, you got an issue and a problem. And we all agreed that we would refer these officers to treatment outside of their departments so that we could get them help. And as a result, they got better, they got healthier. And so if we really want to fix not just criminal justice, but reduce incidents of violence, if we want to reduce criminality, if we want to improve public safety, we have to improve our mental health system. Because if we do that, it turns out that seems to be the root of most of the people in jail today. In fact, 70% of people in jail in the United States right now, as we sit here today, either have a serious mental illness, a substance use disorder, or both. So we set up the pre-arrest diversion system. We have over 8,800 officers trained. They are my heroes. They have done amazing work. We set up a post-arrest diversion system. We reduced recidivism among the misdemeanor population from 75% to 20%. And we reduced recidivism among the felony population from 75% to 6% for those that finish the program, which is the vast majority. But what we realized at the end of the day, that we were still stuck with 20 to 30% of the population, that we were not succeeding at the level we would like. Look, 70% success is amazing, but we wanted 100. And we realized is that when community mental health was designed in the United States, the most acutely ill with the psychotic disorders were still in state hospitals. Community mental health in the United States was developed for people with moderate mental illnesses, not serious and persistent or acute mental illnesses. And so when we closed the hospitals and we did all the other stuff I talked about, they got thrown into communities that was not built for them. And so we realized that if we were really going to finally solve this, and the crown and the jewel in the crown that we needed was a different kind of capacity or facility that addressed the needs for this really high acute population. And I have to tell you, we know who they are. We do all kinds of studies. We did one study with the University of South Florida. We sent them 3,300 names. We asked them to tell us who the highest users of both criminal justice and mental health services were in Dade County. They narrowed it down to 97 people. These 97 people were arrested 2,200 times. They spent 27,000 days in the Dade County jail, 13,000 days in a psychiatric crisis unit, cost taxpayers tens of millions, got nothing for it. We recently went back. We looked at the same population since 1985. They've been arrested 4,700 times. They spent 97,000 days in the Dade County jail, costing taxpayers tens and tens of millions and more dollars. We've become pretty sophisticated at our diversion program. And so the county sends the court a list every single day of who is eligible to be diverted into treatment. So as we're getting ready to open this facility that I'm going to talk about in a second, we said, let's look at that list over the last 5 years. There were 16,400 people on that list. Those 16,400 people all had a primary serious mental illness. They met criteria by the level of charge. It wasn't a violent offense, and they didn't have more than 4 felony convictions. Those 16,400 people spent 1.2 million days in the Dade County jail. They cost taxpayers $414 million, and most of them just got out of jail and went right back to the street doing what they were doing before. They're not a great threat of harm or violence, but they are a great threat to themselves by deteriorating so bad that their brains become permanently damaged, and they become a threat to the quality of life in the community. And so we realized that we needed to do something else. They cost $414 million, these 16,000 people, over 5 years. So what we realized is we needed something else. And so we looked around the country, what was working, what was not working, and we realized there are like 15 essential elements or so that a community needs, that these individuals need to actually recover. And we put all of those essential elements in one location. We got the state to lease us the old competency restoration facility on Northwest 7th Avenue between 22nd and 23rd Street near Camilla's house. Then Speaker of the House Marco Rubio, this is how long this project has been going on, helped us get the building. Ron Book helped us get the building. We paid $1 a year for 99 years. And the taxpayers understood this sometimes better than the politicians, because they overwhelmingly voted to support a bond issue to take bond issue dollars and build this one-stop shop for the most acutely ill that consistently cycle again and again. And so inside the facility, it's amazing. It's 181,000 square feet. It's 7 stories. It has a receiving facility, a crisis stabilization unit, a short-term residential. There is a courtroom in the facility so we can manage both criminal and civil cases. It has everything that the population needs to get back on their feet when they are in recovery so they can get employed. And so the idea is to take people who otherwise would just get kicked to the curb once we adjudicated their case, but instead to gently and slowly reintegrate them back into the community with all the supports that they need to maintain their recovery so that we can substantially reduce the jail population. Look, 3/4 of the people in jail as we sit here right now qualify for this facility. Could you imagine if we could even cut half of the number of beds that we still have in the jail and get them into this facility? Why? Because when people are in jail, there's no Medicaid, there's no Medicare, and there's no insurance. The county has to pay 100% of the population. This is what drives me the craziest, I would say, and I probably shouldn't use that term. Right now, the county is spending $570 million a year to incarcerate 4,400 people. $570 million, of which 63%, 2/3 of that amount is going to people with mental illnesses, about $414 million a year. We looked at a 10-year period of what the county spent on jail. $3.9 billion over the last 10 years to pay for operating cost of one jail for people with mental illnesses, of which 63% or $2.5 billion went to people with serious mental illnesses. Because when we open this building, we will take this population that is so expensive that's not covered by Medicaid and transfer them into a facility where we can start to bill Medicaid and reduce the burden and cost to the county. It will improve our public safety. It will save the county hundreds of millions of dollars, and it will give this population, for the first time in many of their lives, an opportunity to have a life of hope and recovery. We've run into some political issues. We have a bunch of new county commissioners. They inherited this project. They weren't brought up in understanding all the facts that I just gave you. And so a lot of issues have come up about the cost to the county to operate it, because the first 3 years essentially are free for the county because we have the federal money from COVID and we've got opioid settlement dollars. There's not one penny that the county has to put up for basically the first 3 years. We will be able to have proof of concept. University of Miami will be doing system research. They will study every individual that comes in there. We will see how much it costs, how much it saves. And then at that point, the county can vote, commissioners can vote and decide if they want to fund it moving forward. We have asked, and we believe all it's going to take is no more than $10 million a year from the county. But compared to spending $570 million a year in jail cost, it's a bargain. Plus, working with other communities like Miami and Miami Beach and with the state and federal government, we hope to even reduce that $10 million a year burden to the county so that they're getting the full benefit, saving the dollars, and getting us the outcomes that we truly believe are going to change the way we handle this population. It will put Miami-Dade on the map as the first community in the United States to get to functional zero homelessness. It will put us on the map for addressing one of the most complex problems any urban community has, and we will have a solution for it. And so I am hopeful people watching this, they will reach out to their county commissioners and strongly encourage them to vote yes when this item comes up before them to support the operating plan. So thank you for the opportunity to talk about it.
Outstanding. Judge Steve Liefman has just given us an in-depth briefing that's taken us maybe 30 years down the trajectory of the evolution of a battle that not only Miami-Dade has, the state of Florida has, but the country has to help those who are suffering mental health in a humane and cost-effective manner. Judge, we cannot thank you enough. Please keep us posted.
Sure.